Hello, it's good to be with you today. My name is Dr. Brad Mariano. I'm Assistant Professor of Educational Policy and Leadership at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and I direct the Center for Research Evaluation and Assessment on campus. We're joined today by Dr. Carleen McCormick-Lee, who serves as a visiting scholar in the Educational Policy and Leadership program at UNLV. In September 2019, Governor Sisolak appointed Carleen chair of the Nevada Commission on School Funding. With expertise and skills in leading successful reforms across diverse and complex systems, Dr. McCormick-Lee drives educational transformation by shaping innovative programs to achieve critical educational goals for children. Also with us is Senator Mo Dennis, who has been working in his community for over 3 decades, serving in capacities such as chairing the PTA, sitting on Clark County Library Board, serving as an elected assemblyman, current state senator representing District 2, and Nevada State President pro tempore, where he is fighting and advocating for Nevada families. As state senator, Mo has taken up education, consumer rights, and economic development as his key priorities, passing legislation and chairing committees to address these issues. Also with us is Senator Carrie Buck, who has spent 25 years in education, has served in the role of classroom teacher, English language learner specialist, assistant principal, lead principal, executive director, and president. She holds a master's degree in administration and supervision and a doctoral degree in organizational leadership, public education executive leadership academy, and USC Superintendent's Academy, and Georgetown Education Finance Certificate. In 2014, as executive director of Pinecrest Academy of Nevada, Dr. Buck increased enrollment and student achievement from one struggling school with 700 students and a 3-star rating to 4 campuses with 5 stars in both elementary and middle schools, serving nearly 6,000 students. In 2018, it was designated one of the top charter school networks in the state. Dr. Buck was elected to the state Senate on November 16th, 2020. We'll start today with a 15-minute presentation from Dr. McCormick-Lee on the findings and recommendations from the committee, and then we'll move into a question and answer session. We'll take audience questions via the Q&A bar down at the bottom of your screen. So with that, we'll turn it over to Dr. McCormick-Lee for a presentation of findings.
First of all, I just want to say good morning. Thank you very much. It was very kind words from the governor as well. My first slide is actually I've got a little bit of a slide just to help keep me on track because we want to make sure we get you a lot of information quickly in the 15 minutes that we have. So first of all, my first slide is really about acknowledging the work of others. The governor mentioned Superintendent Joan Ebert and all of the work that she has done on this. And I also want to acknowledge that this is not the first time that Mo Dennis has talked about this particular topic, since he and Joyce Woodhouse were 2 of the leaders within the Nevada State Senate who brought this work forward and actually instituted. It was that legislation, SB 543, that instituted and commissioned, so to speak, the Commission on School Funding. So I just want to make sure I acknowledge all the work that had gone on before the work of the commission. And now I'm going to shift to the work of the commission and really focus the rest of this time on the work that we've done. I do also want to say that I am one member. I have the honor of being the chair, but I am one member. So the conversations that I'm sharing with you today and the insights, not only during the presentation, but on the panel, are that of one member of the commission. The commission is 11 people, and I'm going to share the work of that 11 people. As you take a look at those names, my hope is that you're going to recognize some of the names, and if you don't recognize the names, you're going to recognize the expertise. There are Vice Chair Guy Hobbs has had over 40 years in working in finance and looking at funding initiatives for taxes across the state of Nevada and beyond. Dusty Casey, working from the charter perspective. So we wanted to make sure that this organization or this commission really has a broad range of experts across the state. So Dusty is actually from Churchill, and he's a chief financial officer of a charter school. AJ Fueling from Carson City, Jason Gowdy from Clark County School District are both chief financial officers, and Dr. David Jensen is the superintendent from Humboldt in the north. And Paul Johnson and Mark Mathers are both chief financial officers, one Paul from White Pine, Mark Mathers from Washoe. So we actually have 5 sitting chief financial officers on this commission. So they have steeped in this information, not only in terms of the past, but also how we can improve this model for the future. And next 3 people actually have insights beyond chief financial officers within a school district. Poonam Mather has long been working in business as well as in philanthropy and working on behalf of education across Nevada. So she brings a community and business perspective. Dr. Lisa Morris Hibbler from the Community Services in City Las Vegas, as well as Jim McIntosh, who is the Chief Financial Officer of the City of Henderson. So we really have across the state and some strong expertise in finance. So what have we been working on? Well, first of all, we had to take in the idea of the context of where we live. We hear a lot about how unique Nevada is and how different we are. But the important piece is that we needed to take that element into context. Across 49 of the 50 states, the cost of education is really divided among local dollars, state dollars, and federal resources. Well, the interesting piece is no 2 states distribute that money in the same way or exactly the same manner. There's 2 primary ways to be able to do this, and that is resource allocation. So actually saying, this is how many teachers you need, this is how much technology you need, this is how much maintenance you need, this is how much utility costs you need. However, that really narrows the ability of a school district to really have the flexibility to make decisions about the best way, and not just districts, but schools. So that's one of the struggles with resource allocation. The other model, which is actually 33 states across the country, actually have a foundation formula. And that foundation formula really begins with the concept of children. So a per pupil funding amount is identified, that base or that foundation on which you build upon. And then many states choose to supply districts with funding above and beyond that base to really target the needs of individual students. This is important because it recognizes the individual needs of students, plus it allows the flexibility of schools and districts to really address those needs. So that's an important context that we wanted to take a look at. We wanted to look across the country to be able to see what other places are doing in terms of their funding. We looked at both states across the West that we thought might be similar, but we also looked into the East and the middle of the country, where we found states that were surpassing Nevada in terms of student achievement and performance. What are they doing right that we might be able to capture? Well, Nevada is a land of contrast. So one of the things we had to recognize is that Nevada is very different from some of those states. We have from mountains to deserts, we've really got a diverse and unique ecosystem. We have some of the tallest mountains and the lowest valleys. But in terms of our school districts, our students are diverse and our school districts are diverse. Nye County has more than 18,000 square miles to it. Elko has 17,000 square miles, while Carson City has 152 square miles. So we have these huge expanses with small numbers of students, and we have smaller areas that actually have a large number of students. Clark and Washoe combined, those 2 districts of our 17 districts combined, have almost 380,000 students. But if I combined Esmeralda and Elko, I have about 390 students. We actually don't have a lot of schools in some of our districts that only have 390 students. Yet we have 2 districts I have to combine to reach that number. So we really wanted to take a look at the contrasts of Nevada, not only in terms of cities versus rural, expanses and geographic areas, types of students, but also how does that impact funding? Data from the United States Census shows that small school districts, those that are under 3,000, and clearly Eureka and Esmeralda qualify for that, have per pupil expenditures that are as much as 20%, almost 20% above the national average. And there's several reasons why small districts have higher per pupil costs, but most center around the fact that that larger districts can really take advantage of economies of scale. They do more and bigger, and so they can replicate practices. So one of the things that people do, or states have done across the country, and indeed the commission did, was start to take a look at some of our geographically isolated districts, our necessarily small schools. Not that a district would choose to have that small of a school, but in order to provide the services for the students, that was what had to be. The plan that the governor referenced, Nevada plan, we're shifting from, part of the work is shifting from the Nevada plan, which is the current plan. It's been in place since 1967. I think Mo might later share with you how old he was when that came about. I know that I was, let me see, I think I was in grade school and actually fairly young in grade school. And some folks listening to this probably weren't even born. So that came about, and Nevada was a very different state, different groups of students, different kinds of diversity. And so that plan was put in place. And while it had a strong district focus and ensuring that districts were, the money was distributed across districts in a specific way, it really was not a comprehensive funding formula, and is not. It basically allocates per pupil funding that has to be augmented through other mechanisms, other formulas, other competitive grants. And that's what happened over time. We had the Nevada plan, but then we started to layer class size reduction. Then we started to layer reading programs. And then we started to layer social services. Then we started to layer Zoom schools and victory schools. And we began to layer to compensate for the challenges within the Nevada plan. It's based on cost to educate students, and it's based on revenue that the state makes available for education. It doesn't provide additional students funding based on the needs of the most vulnerable students. So there is nowhere in the Nevada plan that addresses ELL students, English language learners, nor at-risk students. So one of the things that we need to do is really consider how it really fails to take into account actual inflation costs for districts that they face year to year. So there were multiple studies that were commissioned by the legislature in 2006 and 2012 that contained analysis of the Nevada plan and made recommendations to move forward and to consider a Pupil funding plan. Over time, those concerns increased about transparency, trying to understand exactly how many dollars came from what direction. And that's when SB 543 came about, and the commission was created to consider this model, a new model. So one of the key pieces of moving away from the Nevada plan to a pupil-centered funding plan was to take a look at what is the role of the commission. So we took into context what other states were doing, how unique Nevada is, the plan we were moving away from, and the challenges that it had. And then we took a look at SB 543 and said, what is the role? How is it defined within the bill? And those elements are specifically that the commission should make recommendations to improve implementation and efficiencies in terms of implementing the Pupil-Centered funding plan, provide guidance, monitor, and make recommendations to improve that implementation to the Nevada Department of Ed and to school districts, to review per pupil funding amounts and provide recommendations about equity adjustments, meaning weights. The focus of this summit is equity, so I'm going to talk a little bit more of that on the next couple slides. Recommend cost adjustments for each county. So think about, so what makes Humboldt, Elko, Eureka different, and how do we need to think about the funding for those locations? Review per pupil funding amounts and recommend revisions to create optimal funding. What does optimal funding for public schools in Nevada look like? And if we can define optimal funding, then how do we calculate that? Also, then, how do we fund it? And this is specifically in the bill. What are some methods that could be used to fund optimal funding within the next 10 years? The last component of this is to review laws and regulations related to education and make recommendations to improve efficiency or effectiveness of education in Nevada. So as we took on this work, the commission considered and adopted some core concepts, some core implementation concepts. And here they are: equity, making sure that the funding is equitable to address student needs, specifically calling out those students who really need additional resources because of the needs that they have, academic needs that they have in order to succeed, and also the differences in the cost to educate students across the districts. Transparency. We wanted to make sure we could shine a light on how education dollars are allocated and spent. We wanted to make sure that if a parent, if a community member, if a school, if a principal, if a superintendent said, well, how are those dollars coming to you and how must they be spent, that they would be able to answer that it wouldn't be a mystery of, do I have to track it back through a set of formulas or grants, or how much money will I get this year? I don't have to wait to find out whether or not I received a grant, but I have those dollars in place and I understand where they came from. Accountability is tied to this as well. So transparency is important, but then accountability, making sure that we can actually track those dollars to ensure that they are supporting the students and the districts and the schools that they were intended. So really being able to have metrics around funding equity, spending trends, school spending expenditures, and then the capacity for districts and schools to support children, specifically those with special needs. Then flexibility, which to me is one of the most important elements of this. The ability to have a finance formula that does not contain arbitrary and restrictive provisions that cause inequities and limit local discretion in terms of how to spend those dollars. So that ability for educators to have flexibility to align school spending with student needs is incredibly important. As we did that, what we started to have conversations with was what we affectionately call the waterfall, which hopefully that'll make sense in just a minute. So what I wanted to do is share with you that this is how the waterfall starts. It starts with the state education fund.
We have 1 minute left.
Yep.
And we're going to move to Q&A.
Yep.
Thanks.
You got it. I'm there. So the State Education Fund, it starts here. There's approximately 80 different funding sources that come together to create that fund. It starts with state administration. It moves through school operations. So the State Department pulls dollars out, then school operations, then the per pupil funding, and it moves through the cost adjustments to address the index for individual school districts, and then weighted funding specifically for English language learners, gifted and talented, and also at-risk students. We've isolated special education. With that, once that waterfall occurs, we made recommendations to improve. We recommended redefining at-risk from just free and reduced lunch to something broader. We recommended protecting special education so that it is not subject to ups and downs in terms of what a district or a school might want to do. We also requested flexibility and alignment in reporting, and we recommended that hold harmless be expanded to all schools across the state. If you want more information regarding pupil-centered funding plan, I highly recommend that you go to the website on my screen. All of the information from all of the meetings is there. We are now, interestingly, moving toward optimal funding and monitoring implementation, and that is our focus for the next few months.
Thank you so much, Dr. McCormick. We really appreciate your overview there. We'll now move into the question and answer session of our panel here. And down at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a Q&A button where you can submit audience questions, and I'll take a look at those as we move. I have some pre-prepared questions that we'll jump right into, and this is for everyone here. So the first thing I want to talk about here is in letters to the governor and legislature back in July, with these accompanying recommendations that were made, the commission said the following, that the work of the commission highlights the fact that Nevada's base funding must be increased. So when the funding formula was unveiled back in 2019, one of the major talking points then was that it didn't discuss additional sources of revenue. And then the counterpoint to that was, well, we first need to tackle how this funding is allocated equitably. That was the main goal of this pupil-centered funding formula. So my first question is this to everyone here. After over a year of work as a commission, can this funding formula work without addressing funding levels? Why or why not?
Senator Dennis, I'd be glad to start.
Great.
So the answer is yes. In fact, I'm excited because we now have the ability to actually look at education and see how do we actually fund education? What are the needs? And this new funding formula actually, while you mentioned that it doesn't put any more money into it, and in that aspect, we didn't address that in this bill on purpose, because what we've done, and the reason we had a funding formula for 50 years was that every time we tried to talk about education funding formula, all we ever talked about was getting more money for education, instead of looking at how is it that we actually allocate and making sure that the dollars that were for education are going to education. And so this new funding formula actually is going to allocate more funding in the long run, because things that now get taken away from education and used for other purposes will stay there. So that's the part that is exciting. The other part is that we're actually going to address the needs of students that have additional needs that we haven't addressed in the past. And that's very critical, because if we truly want to improve student achievement, we have to address those issues. So I'm excited that we've got a new funding formula, and Carlene mentioned this earlier. I was a first grader at Robert E. Lake Elementary School the year that the funding formula was implemented in 1967. And it was a much different time then. And for us to have something of this stature and to have a commission that can actually look at these issues when we're not in session, so that they could bring recommendations. I think that's, those are some of the key points of why this is so important as we move forward.
And I'll piggyback on a couple things that Mr. Dennis said. first of all, and I alluded to this, one of the things that we did is the commission worked with consultants and adopted and recommend. I do want to make a comment that the commission is about making recommendations to the legislature and the governor. So when I say we adopted, that means we are recommending, okay? So first of all, that we actually worked on a Nevada cost of living index. And one of the things that this really does is it takes into consideration the cost and the changes and the differences in costs across each of the districts. And actually more discreetly, it actually does it across attendance areas. And then it also layers on the fact that geographical areas, the large geographical areas. So there is actually now a Nevada cost of living index that is used within the formula, and cost of education index actually is what it's called, that doesn't exist anywhere across the country at all, because this is so specific to the needs of our state. That's important because we are so unique. The other piece is, to me, what makes this very interesting too, or important, and even in times of no money, it's even more important to be able to have the flexibility. I had the pleasure of actually working with Dr. Carrie Buck when she was a principal in Clark County School District. And we had many conversations about, if I were allowed, what could I do? And I would be able to do this, this, and this if I was allowed. So with all of the different categoricals that are out there, those dollars that are in grants that say you must buy this, you must pay for this. There's one that says you have a social worker. Social workers are wonderful. And if that's what your school needs, it's great. Maybe your school is struggling in reading. What you wish you could do is actually hire 2 reading specialists. But wait a minute, maybe the school next door is struggling in reading, but they realize it's because some of their children are very traumatized and really need social workers. So it's really about the idea, when you have less dollars, you need even greater flexibility to make sure those dollars are placed into the right location at the right time. Not that I have to purchase, I have to hire this person because that's what that money says, and I have to hire this person because that's what that money says. And I have no leeway based on my personal expertise and knowledge as an educator to be able to address the needs. The other piece is that element of which Mr. Dennis K. mentioned, which is that that idea of equity. Specific children have additional dollars. So it's not about one strand of money coming for that group over there. And that school, which happens to be a half a mile away from me, gets those dollars and I get none to be able to help my students who have the same challenges. But it's about each of the schools, each of the districts having dollars to be able to address the challenges of ELL students, at-risk students, also GATE students. Sometimes we don't think of them as challenges because we think they're just smart. But all of the children who have special needs, we need to be able to have the dollars and the flexibility to be able to address those, even more in tight fiscal times.
Irene writes us here as a question, just as a follow-up to our pupil-centered weights here. Will multiple weights for students be considered? So if a student is at risk and ELL, is that taken into account?
Yeah, at this point, and this is actually part of SB 543, at this point, the child will receive, the recommendation is that the child will receive the highest of whichever weight they are part of. So if English language learner and at risk, whichever is the highest, you would only receive one.
And we had this Senator Dennis, we had a lot of discussion when we put together the language for 543, and you know, that was something that came up, and we felt that, at least especially now as we're beginning this process, the best way to start is to take the highest one that they have, and that would give some additional funds for that.
Thank you. Dr. Buck, did you want to add something there?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, I want to thank Senator Dennis and Senator Woodhouse for this bill. And for Dr. Carlene Lee, it's great seeing you again. She was my boss for empowerment, and she did teach us to, look at things differently. And so I appreciate that. And the rest of the Blue Ribbon experts on that committee. I think it's just exactly what you said. For the principal and the school leader, it's so important that we know where the money is coming from, and then we're able to have a little bit more autonomy to be able to do what is best for the students in our buildings. And so I am very excited about the potential of this happening. And I like the weights because it just makes sense. I like that we are able to see transparent. It's so transparent on where the revenue is coming from, and then being able to do what's best for our students in our buildings, I think is the most important thing. So thank you.
Dr. McCormick-Lee, I appreciate you mentioning that the commission makes recommendations to the governor and to the legislature here. So as we're coming up in this new legislative session, what changes do we anticipate happening to the funding formula as it currently stands?
My hope is that they'll take some of the recommendations we already put forward. I mentioned those quickly in the presentation, the fact that we've made recommendations about protecting special education funds, that we've made recommendations around the timelines that we have. So we've made a set of recommendations, and I did post the website. So if anybody wants to go in there and take a look at those recommendations, I actually, the actual recommendations are closer to 15 pages. So, and again, Dr. Buck works with charter schools, and we felt that it was important to expand the hold harmless beyond just districts, but to expand the concept of hold harmless, which is no district should suffer in terms of the shifting from the old formula to the new. So our recommendation is that it shouldn't be about no district, but no child at any school. So part of the recommendations is to expand that concept of hold harmless to the university as well as the charter schools across the state. Flexibility with alignment and reporting within the existing bill. There's actually some overlapping dates. In other words, and I'm going to give you sort of a hypothetical example. So there's a requirement to report something prior to the ability to deliver the dollars. So how can you report on what happened if you haven't got the dollars to do that yet? So it's a matter of being a little more flexible and making sure that we say things like annually, quarterly. And then the definition of at-risk. The definition of at-risk in the bill is specific to free and reduced lunch. And free and reduced lunch is one of those mysteries of life. I bet if you asked Dr. Buck when she was a principal who was designated free and reduced lunch, she would say to you, I'd love to know. Because you're not privy to that information. And it's one indicator. It is not the definition of being academically at risk. So really thinking beyond just a single indicator or single data point and expanding it to considering academically at risk as well as children in poverty. Certainly poverty is a challenge to overcome, but it is not the only challenge connected to academically at risk. So we're really hoping that our set of recommendations will be considered, as well as protecting special education. I'm just going to spend 1 minute on that because I think it's important. And because we recommended that it not be a weighted value, we do not want anyone to believe we don't think special education students are of value. And need a special assistance. So one of the things we wanted to do is we wanted to set it aside. The reality is no principal and no district should be able to not provide services because it doesn't equal a certain weight. So if I were to say to you, here's per pupil funding, and special education gets a weight of 1, so you get twice as much money, but we have a child that has severe special needs that needs 3 times the amount, you can't say no. You follow the individualized education plan. That is your option. You must meet the needs of that child where that child is. Therefore, what we recommend is that those dollars be brought out of the waterfall, so to speak, and they be protected. So every child, every special education child's needs are met. I see that Terry Janison is here, who works a great deal with autistic children. So my hope is she is out there applauding the concept of protecting those special education dollars, because we don't have an option not to take care of every child and
Right.
each of their needs.
There's some federal requirements to make sure they're held harmless on funding levels. Senator Dennis,
and it's the right thing to do too, right? Maintenance of effort, but it's also right.
right. Senator Dennis, Senator Buck, anything you want to add on what you might be hearing that the legislature might act on?
Well, what I can tell you is I've already set one bill aside, but I've got several others through the Senate Education Committee to be able to look at these issues and see what we can address and what can be done in this session, what needs to be started this session that might maybe take more than one. So we definitely are looking at what we need to do to make those changes.
And just to piggyback on that, I appreciated the fact that there was a continuum of funding, because there are some students with severe needs that that cost so much more. And so that continuum of special education funding is definitely important.
So the committee is now working on the definition of optimal funding. And my question now centers on what that might look like. Does it follow the guidance of past adequacy studies, which kind of set an adequacy target of, I think the most recent was $9,238 per pupil? Does it go beyond that? My question to all of you is when we're moving to optimal funding, what is that going to look like?
I'll take, and know that we're in the middle of those initial conversations around that. One of the things that we've started to do is actually have a conversation around optimal funding in terms of trying to define it. So what does optimal exactly mean? Is it adequate, or is it more than adequate? And so what we have begun to settle on is sort of I'm going to call it a roadmap, because it's actually a pathway toward optimal. And that pathway are things like restoring funding that is, that was recently adjusted, SB 178 dollars, making sure that those come back in and flow through our waterfall, so to speak. So restore, that concept of restore, and making sure that the initial dollars that were there are there. Then the next piece is that adequate. And we do have studies already done in Nevada that indicate that around $9,000 would be adequate in the state of Nevada. Now, those are a couple years old, so I do want to, but still, that is a far cry from where we are right now. Our base, and that $9,000, I should say, is adequate for a base funding. When we calculated the base funding as a commission, it comes out around 7. So we're already about 2,000 or more below those dollars. When you take a look at a national average, the indication is that the national average spent for education is about $12,000 per student. So when we start to take a look at those numbers, that middle piece for adequate, we know is somewhere between a total of, for base funding, is somewhere between $9,000 and $10,000 or $11,000 per student. So we're already thinking there is a gap there of about 3. Now, we haven't done those calculations, so I'm giving you rough numbers based on initial conversations. So what we're beginning to take a look at is that's a first step, right? So when I start to think about $3,000 times about 400+ thousand students, I'm talking about $1.6 billion. So what are the mechanisms for that across 10 years to be able to do that? As we talk about optimal, what we're thinking is beyond adequate. If adequate is what do we need to have students meet state standards, right? State academic standards, and to meet state requirements and federal requirements, then if that's adequate, what is optimal? Is optimal more of an aspirational for each child to be successful? Is optimal connected to the state improvement plan and those targets and goals within the state improvement plan? And is it something that is really connected to continuous improvement? In other words, is optimal something that as you begin to reach toward it, then you re-examine and analyze on a biennium basis what those targets might be and what that funding should be? So that's where we are right now. And we're going into conversations about what are those dollars amounts. I gave you rough numbers. And then we're also going into December's meeting, December 18th meeting. We'll be talking about what are some methods that might make sense to consider for recommending to the governor and the legislature to fund this over the course of the next 10 years. Did that help answer?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Let me follow up with Senator Buck and Senator Dennis. So I know Clark County Education Association put forward enough signatures for 2 ballot initiatives, one that proposes increasing the local school support tax and the other increasing the state's gaming tax rate. These will work their way through a process that will take a bit. But more generally, where do we start to look for additional educational revenue?
So let me go back just for a second. The fact that we can have this discussion now about what do we need more dollars for, because we're looking at what's adequate, what's optimal. You know, in the past, it was really hard to have that discussion because all we were talking about is we need more money for education, and everybody say, okay, well, where do we put it and what do we need it for? And by having this new funding formula that allows us to have that discussion, we can now look to all the different ways to fund education, and especially to highlight the fact that we need more money for education, and here's why, in what areas that we need it. I think having that kind of discussion will help us really be able to get to something where we can actually get more money for education. Because in the past, you talk to folks and they say, well, yeah, we want to do more, we support education, but we want to know where it's going. You know, the fact that we've got a funding formula now that's transparent, that we can talk to people and they can understand how it works, that it's student-centered. I think that's going to make this discussion about, okay, now where do we get this additional funding from? And there's very few ways that you can actually raise revenue. We're limited because there's not an unlimited way of doing that. And so the fact that you know, CCEA can bring up something that we need to have these discussions about on how we get more funding, I think that that's important, and that's the next step now, having this new funding formula.
Senator Buck, anything to add there?
Sure, I agree with my colleague, Senator Dennis, in that before it was all in isolated pockets and nobody knew that number that the schools were actually getting or the school districts were actually getting, because there were isolated grants and different funding sources. And so now that it is transparent through this formula, I look forward to seeing where we're at and then where we need to go, and Dr. Lee's roadmap.
And just to Dr. Marine, just to add to that kind of conversation, one of the pieces we're going to be talking about in December, which I'm kind of excited about because this is an area I don't know that well. Most of the conversations we've had so far, 40 some years in education, I sort of understand how districts and schools work. But this whole idea of revenue, so one of the conversations we're going to have is, so of the revenue ability to generate revenue, what is there? Do you have to raise or add a tax, or do you think about current elements in a different way? And so we have the luxury of Vice Chair Guy Hobbs' expertise and knowledge, and he started to have conversations around sufficiency. What are the dollars that, what are the kinds of revenue generation that are sufficient, predictable, stable, that are less volatile? And each one of those words has meaning to him beyond my understanding. So one of the things that the commission is going to do is dive into, here are the different kinds of revenues that are out there. I just learned recently that there is a tire tax, which apparently would not meet the sufficiency criteria for raising revenue for education. However, the other thing I learned is that starting to think about, wait a minute, do we have to increase the amount of taxes, or do we change what we are taxing? As an example, the idea of sales tax. In the state of Nevada, and I hope I get this right, we tax retail tangible products. And what that amounts to is about 40% of those things that are actually purchased retail. So as we start to think about it, it might not be increasing the sales tax, but maybe changing some of the things that might be taxed. I don't know the answer to all of these, as you can tell. I am just learning these things. But since, you know, one of the good news about being an educator is I love to learn. So this is sort of the challenge of being the chair of the commission, is to be able to take a look at this new information and really think in depth and so to speak, dive into that rabbit hole head first and take a look at what is it, how do we consider, what do we think about it, what are some of the recommendations that we can make to the legislature and the governor, to Senator Buck and Senator Dennis. Yep.
One of the things that, that didn't talk about with this new funding formula, the fact that it all goes in one place and stays with education, actually over a 10-year period, that actually increases education. Mm-hmm. And I can't remember what the current number is, but I know when we were having these discussions last session, that was almost like $1 billion over 10 years that would be put back into education that's currently going to other places. And then the flexibility issue that we talked about. If you know, if schools have the ability to be more flexible on some things, they might be able to save some money in one area and spend more in another area and still be able to achieve what they're trying to get. So I think there's some things there too with the new funding formula that allows us to do things better and get the achievement, and also get some more additional dollars there, and without doing anything different except that we change the funding formula.
Good point. That education stabilization fund, that's that right. At the end, if there are dollars that were unspent by districts or schools, that they in the past would just revert and go somewhere, right? And now they go back into an education stabilization fund, which is has potential to be a huge impact.
So this funding formula is set to be implemented by fiscal year 2022. And we're in really this unique fiscal situation with COVID-19 and the fiscal impact. Does this keep you up at night when we run this through the waterfall, we start implementing the weights, and all of a sudden we find out we don't have enough dollars to hold harmless, particularly some of our rural districts and their funding levels? Like, I'll ask this first to Senator Buck and Senator Dennis. Like, do you think we're going to be ready to implement this thing by fiscal year 2022?
Well, what I will say is yes, we're ready. What's the alternative? The alternative is to continue doing what we're doing, which we're not funding it, and money's going back that's not going for education. I think we're stepping backwards. I don't think we have an option at this point. We have to move forward with what we've got so that we can do better for education. I mean, that's why we did this. You know, we had this funding formula that was there for 50 years, but we all know that it needs to be changed in the way we do things. So I think that, I mean, while there are issues that, you know, you have to look at and address, because nothing's ever perfect. I don't think there's an option here. I think we move forward and work out all those issues that need to be worked out as we move forward.
I mean, with us going through the pandemic, it's definitely impacted our economy, and as nothing has before. And so it will be important to balance, but I do believe that this funding formula brings greater transparency to revenue and to where money is dispersed. And so the bottom line is, when everyone sees this process, it does make for improvements.
Awesome. So this is a PK-16 discussion. So I want to move, as we finish up here for the last few minutes, to the higher education realm. We know back during the Great Recession, and she kind of took it on the chin then. And during the special session in July, you know, our higher education system had to make some very difficult cuts. So kind of looking forward, what do you think lies ahead for Nevada's higher education system in light of the state's fiscal situation?
Well, I'll go. You know, these are challenging times, and we've been, you know, we've been through this before, and part of it has to do with the way that we, you know, that we fund things, and our system of relying on a revenue stream that when you have these kinds of issues like a pandemic or a recession, that we lose money. So that's kind of up and down. However, I think that there's a commitment as far as the legislature and trying to do what we can to help our higher education system. It's critical. And we, over the last, you know, few years have been doing a lot of different things to try to help bolster that up. You know, we've created even opportunities for kids that didn't even go to school before, whether it's the Promise Scholarship or the Silver State Opportunity Grants, you know, trying to bolster up, you know, and I'm actually going to be working on with the Treasurer's Office, trying to figure out ways that we can stabilize that fund to help kids be able to get, whether it's the Millennium Scholarship or these other scholarships, so that we're not having to every 2 years try to figure this out. But that said, there still has to be a commitment on our part as the legislature and as Nevadans that this is important to us, and we've got to, you know, figure out ways that we can fund things that need to be funded. We've seen some great things happen, and you know, we've got to get through this pandemic, trying to figure out how we're going to do that. But I know there's a lot of good people that are working on it, and you know, I'm committed, as I know many others are, my colleagues, to figure out a way that we can get through this without impacting higher ed too much, and so that we can get through this quickly.
Senator Buck, anything to add there?
Just, I really, at my day job, I support students who are going through dual enrollment. And so, you know, raising money for those sorts of things, I just see such a value in that. If students are ready to go to college, think about that. Great use of tax dollars in that we're paying for their college in high school, and they're able to graduate 2 years already up. By the time they're done with their high school diploma, they have an associate's degree. And so what a great use of tax dollars for our students. I think it benefits the universities in which they attend. It benefits the students in general. And so that's really where I want to focus this next session.
Awesome. We have 3 minutes left. Senator Buck, I wanted to go back to you as a building school leader. You think about this funding formula, how does it impact equity in the everyday lives of our students? Like how would you see this really shaping what's happening in the day-to-day lives of our students with this new funding formula?
Well, that's the question when it comes to implementation, in which we really have to hold our school districts accountable, that it transcends to school buildings, that surplus dollars aren't necessarily stripped back, because it needs to go to the students in which it's named for. And so we do want to make sure that we put things in place that will prevent you know, districts from taking those dollars back, and that it does go to the students for which it is intended. And so, yeah, I think that's important.
Senator Dennis, anything to add there about how you hope to see this shape the day-to-day lives of our students?
Well, you know, when I walked into that kindergarten classroom 30 plus years ago as a dad of a kindergartner, and volunteered to do PTA, I realized back then that we needed to do something to help all of our kids. And I think, you know, the good things that are going on with the new funding formula and the commitment and the discussions that we're having on education, I think there's just some really positive things that we've got to, you know, we've got to keep on the ball and keep doing it. It's not something that we're going to fix and then it'll just keep going on its own, but we're going to have to continue to fight. But I'm excited for us because we can truly have some of these important discussions on how do we help kids. And it's really truly based on the needs of the child, which is why I got involved in this in the first place. And there's some great people that want to do the same thing. So I'm excited for the future for Nevada, for our kids. and the commitment that we're making to them through these efforts in education.
Well, we all look forward to seeing future commission meetings and how this really plays out in the legislature moving forward. I want to commend you for your hard work in fighting for Nevada kids and moving towards what we believe to, or what I believe, I should speak for myself, to be a more equitable way to do school funding. And so there are challenges ahead, but I am assured that the commission will be able to rise to those challenges, and our legislature will keep in mind our students moving forward. So we want to thank you for joining us today. Please feel free, audience, to reach out to our senators directly and Dr. McCormick Lee directly if you have comments or concerns. And we hope you'll stick with us for the remaining sessions going forward. Thank you again.